They threw her trunk into the mud at 5:15 in the morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, and Eleanora Voss watched her dead husband's surgical instruments scatter across the puddle like silver fish gasping for air. The sheriff did not look at her when he spoke. He kept his eyes on the door of the asylum, the one she had cleaned and maintained for 11 years, as the resident caretaker, the one whose brass hinges she had oiled every October with rendered tallow. "You got till the road dries," he said. "Then I don't know you." She was 47. Her husband had been the county physician before the fever took him in 81, and for 6 years after his death, she had kept the asylum running on a salary the county board paid in quarterly installments that arrived later each season. The building had not housed patients in 9 years. It was a storage facility now officially, though what it stored was mostly dust, and the smell of lye soap baked into plaster walls. The board had voted the previous Tuesday to sell the property to Marcus Coulter, who owned the feed store and 3 of the 4 lots on Main Street. Coulter wanted the land for a lumber depot. The building would come down by August, and Eleanora, who slept in the east wing and grew herbs in the courtyard and knew every pipe and beam in the structure, the way a mother knows the bones of her child's face, was simply in the way. "She won't last a week out there," said Dottie Raines from the porch of the boarding house across the road. Dottie was drinking coffee from a tin cup, watching the eviction, the way one watches a dog chase its tail. That woman doesn't know a soul who'd take her in. What Dottie did not know, what none of them knew, was that Eleanora had spent 11 years learning the building's secrets, and one of those secrets ran 40 feet below the basement, where the original builders in 1853 had dug a root cellar into a thermal vent that kept the air at 58 degrees year-round, even when January dropped to 30 below. She picked up her husband's bone saw from the mud, wiped it on her skirt. The steel was still good. Eleanora did not leave. She walked back inside. The sheriff had already mounted his horse by the time she reached the side entrance, the one half hidden behind the dead jasmine vine that had frozen in the November of 79 and never been cleared. He did not see her slip through. No one did. The main floors were lost to her now. She understood that. Coulter's men would come with crowbars and kerosene within the month. But the basement was different. The basement was hers in the way that underground places belong to whoever knows their passages, and Eleanora knew everyone. She descended the back staircase, the one the orderlies had used decades ago to carry soiled linens to the boiler room without disturbing patients. The steps were narrow, worn concave in the center from years of foot traffic. The walls smelled of calcium deposits and old mortar. At the bottom, she turned left, where anyone else would turn right, and pushed through a door that had been painted to match the wall so completely that even she had missed it for her first 3 years. Behind it, a corridor sloped downward at a grade steep enough to make her press one palm against the ceiling. The air changed within 20 steps. Warmer. Wetter. The mineral smell of hot stone, like the inside of a tea kettle, left too long on the stove. The thermal cellar opened before her, like a cathedral crypt. 30 feet long, 12 wide, with a ceiling of natural rock that wept condensation in slow, fat drops. Against the far wall, water seeped from a crack in the limestone, not a stream, exactly more of a constant weeping that collected in a shallow basin someone had chiseled decades before she arrived. The water was warm to the touch, not hot enough to scald, but warm enough that the air in the chamber never dropped below the temperature of a cool autumn afternoon. She had discovered this place in her 4th year, had told no one, not even her husband in the months before his death. It had been hers, a private wonder, a place where she grew mushrooms on oak logs and dried herbs that needed consistent temperature. Now it would be her home. The first night she slept on bare stone, with her coat folded under her head, and the warmth from below kept her comfortable enough that she woke only twice. Both times it was the silence that startled her. No wind, no creaking timbers, just the patient drip of mineral water and the faint sulphur breath of the earth. By the third day, she had carried down what she could salvage from the upper floors before Coulter's men arrived. A straw mattress, 2 wool blankets, her husband's medical bag with its instruments and 3 bottles of tincture, a cookpot, a bundle of candles, and from the courtyard, before anyone noticed, she dug up the wooden box she had buried beneath the dead rosebush 2 winters ago. Inside the box were silkworm eggs. Not many. Perhaps 200, wrapped in oiled cloth and packed in sawdust. Her husband had received them from a Chinese physician in San Francisco in 1879, along with a letter explaining their care in handwriting, so precise it looked like engraving. James had never done anything with them, but Eleonora had read that letter so many times the folds had worn to transparency. The thermal cellar was perfect. Silkworms needed consistent warmth. They needed mulberry leaves which grew wild along the creek bed 1/2 mile east. They needed patience, which Eleonora had in quantities that would have exhausted most men. She set the eggs near the warm wall and waited. The town forgot about her quickly. This was not unusual. Women alone in that part of Montana Territory in 1887 had a way of disappearing from public consciousness like snow evaporating off a tin roof. Marcus Coulter began dismantling the asylum's upper floors in June. His workers never found the basement entrance behind the painted wall. They assumed the cellar was just the boiler room they could see from the main stairs, and they stripped the boiler for scrap copper without looking further. Above her, the building came apart, board by board. Below, Eleonora built. She constructed frames for the silkworms from discarded lath boards she pulled from the demolition debris at night, moving like a ghost through the wreckage after the workers left. She mixed clay from the creek bank with straw and packed it into the gaps in the cellar walls where drafts crept through. She rigged a ventilation shaft using a length of stovepipe she found in the rubble, angling it upward through a natural fissure in the rock that opened behind a thicket of wild currant bushes 50 yards from the asylum's foundation. The silkworms hatched in late June. They were small and pale, like fragments of rice come alive, and they ate with a sound like distant rain on paper. Eleonora fed them mulberry leaves she gathered before dawn, when the dew was still heavy and the leaves were tenderest. She sorted them by size on the lath frames, kept the temperature steady by adjusting the flow of warm water through channels she carved in the soft limestone floor. By August, the first generation had spun their cocoons. She had expected white silk. What she got was something else. The mineral water that seeped through the walls left deposits on the mulberry leaves, and the worms that fed on those leaves produced thread with a faint golden tinge, like sunlight trapped in amber. She unspooled her first cocoon with hands that shook not from cold, but from the strangeness of beauty appearing in a place meant for forgetting. She built a simple loom from ash wood and twine. Her mother had been a weaver in Pennsylvania before the family moved west, and Eleonora's fingers remembered what her conscious mind had half forgotten. The shuttle moved, the warp tightened, the cloth grew. It was during the weaving that she began the practice that would later terrify the town. Into each bolt of silk she wove a date, not with different-colored thread, but with a subtle change in tension that created a pattern visible only when the cloth was held at a specific angle to lamplight. The date she wove was always the same. November 17th, 1887, the day James had died. She did not think of it as morbid. She thought of it as memory-made material grief, given a grammar that fingers could read. She did not know yet what that date would come to mean to everyone else. September brought Marcus Coulter to the creek bed, where Eleonora gathered mulberry leaves. He was not looking for her. He was surveying timber rights along the water, but he saw her crouched by the bank with her basket, and he stopped his horse. She expected cruelty. What she got was worse. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she recognized from her years caring for the mentally ill. It was the look attendants gave patients they considered beyond help, not hatred. Pity so complete it erased the other person entirely. "You're still here," he said. "I thought you'd gone to Helena." She said nothing. "There's work at the laundry," he said. "If you need it." His voice was careful the way one speaks to a child or a dog. Then he clicked his tongue and rode on. That night she wove faster. The golden silk accumulated on its bolt like a slow argument against everything they believed about her. October arrived with teeth. The aspens along the ridge went yellow in a single week, and then the wind stripped them bare overnight, and the mountains above town wore their first white caps by the 12th. Old-timers talked about the winter of '72, when 3 families froze in their cabins before February, but they talked about it the way men talk about war stories, with pride in their survival rather than fear of recurrence. Eleonora prepared. She carried down stores of dried mushrooms, root vegetables she bartered for with silk thread from a ranch wife who asked no questions. She sealed every gap in her cellar with clay and horsehair. She built a second chamber off the main one, smaller, tighter, where she could sleep, surrounded by the warmth of the thermal vent on 3 sides. The silkworms in their 4th generation now were fat and productive, spinning cocoons the size of hens' eggs. And then on November 14th, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the barometer at Hollister's general store dropped so fast the needle ticked audibly. The blizzard came on the 16th. Not gradually, not with warning squalls, but all at once, as if God had upended a bucket of white violence over the entire valley. The temperature fell 40 degrees in 6 hours. Snow drove horizontal, so thick a man could not see his own outstretched hand. The wind came from the north at speeds that tore shingles from roofs and snapped fence posts like matchsticks. By midnight of the first night, 3 homes on the east side of town had lost their stove chimneys to the wind, and the families inside huddled under every blanket they owned while their water buckets froze solid on the kitchen floor. By dawn of the 17th, the temperature had reached 34 below zero, and the snow was 4 feet deep on level ground and drifted to the roof lines on the north side of every structure. The second day was worse. A section of the mercantile roof collapsed under the snow weight. The schoolhouse chimney cracked from thermal shock, and 14 children had to be carried through chest-deep snow to the church, which was the only building with walls thick enough to hold heat. But the church had no stove, only a fireplace, and the wood supply stacked behind it was meant for Sunday services, not survival. In her cellar, Eleonora heard nothing. The earth above her was a blanket thicker than any blizzard could penetrate. The thermal vent breathed its steady warmth. The silkworms ate their leaves. The water in the basin stayed at 58 degrees. She had light from candles and oil she had stored. She had food for 3 weeks. She was perhaps the only person in a 50-mile radius who was comfortable. She did not know about the storm until the morning of the 18th, when she climbed her ventilation shaft and pushed aside the snow that had buried the currant bushes. What she saw stopped her breath. The world was white and still and broken. Trees lay snapped like bones across the hillside. The town below was half buried, smoke rising thin and desperate from chimneys that still functioned. She could have stayed below. No one knew she was there. No one would come looking. She owed this town nothing. Less than nothing. Eleonora stood in the snow up to her waist, the warm air rising from her tunnel like breath from a sleeping animal. And she thought about Dottie Raines saying she would not last a week. She thought about the sheriff who would not meet her eyes. She thought about Marcus Coulter and his pity that erased her from existence. Then she thought about the 14 children in the church with no stove. She went back down. She packed a bundle of silk cloth, the golden cloth with the date woven in its grain. Not because she planned to give it away, but because she would need something to prove she was real when she arrived. The walk to town took 2 hours through snow that tried to swallow her with every step. She arrived at the church door looking like a figure from a fever dream, coated in white, her breath crystallizing on her collar. Reverend Aldis opened the door and stared at her, as if she were a ghost. "I have a place," she said. "Underground. It's warm. I can take the children." He did not ask how. He did not ask where she had been. He looked at the children behind him, blue-lipped and shaking under threadbare quilts, and he said, "Show me." She led them in groups of 4, the smallest ones carried on the backs of the older boys. The passage was narrow and the way was difficult, but the earth did not care about blizzards, and the thermal vent did not care about wind. By nightfall, all 14 children were in her cellar, sitting on her lath frames among the sleeping silkworms, eating dried mushrooms and drinking warm mineral water, their color returning to their faces like ink spreading through cloth. Dottie Raines came the next day, half frozen, led by Reverend Aldis. She stood in the golden light of Eleonora's oil lamp and looked at the silk on the loom and the worms in their frames and the children sleeping warm on beds of straw, and she pressed both hands over her mouth and said nothing for a very long time. Marcus Coulter came on the 5th day of the storm. He came because his lumber depot built on the asylum's foundation had collapsed entirely under the snow, and because his own home had lost its roof, and because he had nowhere else to go. He stood at the entrance to the tunnel hat in his hands, and Eleonora saw that his fingers were black at the tips. Frostbite. Early stage. She stepped aside and let him pass. She soaked his hands in warm water from the basin and applied a poultice of dried yarrow from her stores, the same technique James had written about in his medical journals, the ones no one had thought worth saving. Coulter watched her work and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "I sold your home out from under you." She said, "I know." He said, "I didn't think about where you'd go. I just didn't think about it." She tied off the bandage. The yarrow smelled sharp and green like crushed grass in summer. "I know that too," she said. The blizzard lasted 9 days. By its end, Eleonora's cellar held 31 people. The silk loom had been moved against the wall to make room, and the silkworms had been relocated to the smaller sleeping chamber, where they continued their work unbothered by the crowd. The golden cloth she had woven hung across a rope line, dividing the space into sections for families, and in the lamplight, the date in its weave caught the eye of everyone who passed beneath it. November 17th, the day James died, the day the worst of the storm had hit, the date that was already woven into the silk before the blizzard came. People whispered about it. Eleonora did not explain. She did not tell them she wove that date into everything, because it was the day she lost the only person who had ever made her feel visible. Let them think what they wanted. Let them think it was prophecy or witchcraft or divine warning. The cloth did not care about interpretation. It simply held what she had put into it. When the snow finally stopped, and the survivors emerged blinking into a world scoured white and silent, the town of Harker's Flat had lost 4 buildings, 200 head of cattle, and every ounce of the certainty that had made them comfortable enough to throw a woman's trunk into the mud. They did not apologize, not with words. But in March, when the thaw came, the county board voted to deed Eleonora the land beneath the old asylum foundation. The resolution was one sentence long, and no one spoke against it. Marcus Coulter was absent from the meeting. His hands had healed, but 2 fingers remained stiff, and he had taken to wearing gloves indoors. She expanded the cellar through spring, dug new chambers, installed proper ventilation. By the following winter, the silk operation filled 3 underground rooms, and the golden thread had found buyers in Helena and Butte, who paid 4 times the rate for ordinary silk. She hired 2 of the older children from the blizzard as apprentices. They learned to feed the worms and tend the loom and read the temperature of stone by pressing their cheeks against it. Years later, when the Northern Pacific Railroad surveyors came through and asked what the building was meaning, the new structure Eleonora had built over the cellar entrance, a simple frame house with a workshop attached, Dottie Raines, was the one who answered. She was older then, her voice thinner, but she spoke clearly enough. "That's where we go when the world gets too cold," she said. On the loom inside, a new bolt of silk was growing golden as ever, and if you held it to the lamplight at the proper angle, you could see a date woven into its grain. But it was not November 17th anymore. It was March 4th, 1888, the day the county board had signed the deed. The day Eleonora stopped weaving her death date and started weaving her own. The shuttle clacked in the underground warmth. The silkworms ate, and above the Montana wind blew where it pleased, bothering no one who knew where to go when it came.